So imagine this. You're sitting in a grand candlelit hall. Velvet drapes, the scent of old books, a harp quietly resting by the window. Across from you, a man in a gold-trimmed coat leans in, reading a letter that wasn't meant for him. And just like that, his heart changes. Not broken, not angry. Just suddenly aware that the woman he married might not be who she claimed to be. Tonight, we're going deep into one of those royal stories no one ever quite tells right. A tale of trust, betrayal, and the kind of silence that echoed louder than war. It happened over 400 years ago. But the choices they made still feel eerily familiar. And hey, before we step into the palace halls together, I'm super curious. Where are you listening from tonight? Drop your city and time in the comments, so take a breath. Let your body melt into the bed or blanket beneath you. Close your eyes and come with me. The candles are lit, the door is open, and a royal secret is waiting. The year was 1748, and in the northern kingdom of Aldemar, a quiet realm of cold rivers and foggy stone, the king was still young. His name was Leontis, the second of his line. He had soft hands and a thoughtful brow, and a voice that was known to calm even the fiercest court. The people adored him, though he rarely appeared. He ruled from behind tall windows with warm lamps and scrolls, not soldiers. His crown was always polished, but rarely worn. He was not a man of war. He was a man of trust, and in that trust he would fall. At that time, Aldemar was in a delicate peace with its neighbors. No borders moved, no cannons fired, but every letter was read twice, and every visit from across the sea was watched with silent breath. Still, King Leontis believed in kindness. And when a quiet envoy from the southern coast arrived with gold thread and gentle smiles, he welcomed them not as guests, but as friends. Among them was a woman named Seraphine. She did not speak much, but when she did, it was like frost melting off morning glass. Her voice was low, kind, patient. She spoke not of politics, but of poetry. Not of history, but of tea leaves and the way the sea smells in spring. Linus watched her across the court, not with hunger, but with awe. The kind of awe that grows only in quiet kings who have never truly been seen. And Seraphine looked. She looked at him as if he were a man, not a monarch. And in that gaze, the seeds were planted. Within weeks, she was invited to stay. Within months, she no longer dined with the envoy. And one autumn night, under candlelight and the hush of the great hall, he asked her to remain forever. As Queen. The wedding was simple by royal standards. No grand parade, no trumpets calling down the hills. Just a quiet morning ceremony in the stone chapel by the lake, where reeds brushed the water and sparrows danced in the mist. Seraphine wore gray. Not white, not red, not the usual royal shades of festivity, but a soft, storm-colored gray, like fog wrapped in silk. Some whispered it was bad luck. But the king, ever gentle, called it beautiful as the sea before rain. Their vows were short. Her voice never wavered. She said "I do" as if she were reciting an old prayer she'd known since girlhood. And when they turned to face the kingdom, only a few nobles present and a dozen guards in shadow, the people already began to speak. They did not cheer. They watched. Because something in the air had changed. Seraphine did not smile often. And when she did, it was thin, like glass barely catching the sun. She walked through the castle like one who already knew the halls, her hands never brushing the stone. The servants noticed first how she asked questions that queens did not usually ask. About the guards changing posts, about the shipping schedules from the northern port, about the names of minor advisors who hadn't been seen in weeks. And while Leontis adored her, he remained tucked behind his scrolls, dreaming of reforms and peace treaties, believing in the goodness of those closest to him, especially her, especially Seraphine. He trusted her more than any counselor, more than any blood relative, more than even himself. And that trust was her greatest shield. At night, she would sit beside him by the hearth, resting her chin on her folded hands as he read aloud from dusty books. She asked about his father. She asked about old battles. She asked how long the Eastern Wall had stood without repair. He thought she was curious. She thought she was being careful. And all the while, the kingdom breathed quietly, unaware that its crown now rested beside a dagger not drawn. But waiting winter came slowly that year, like a hush falling over the hills. Snow drifted in gentle waves across the courtyard stones, softening the kingdom into a painting of silence. Inside the castle, the fires burned low and steady, and Queen Seraphine moved through the cold halls wrapped in wool and secrets. She had become beloved by some, respected by most, but fully known by none. The old women in the kitchens said she never ate more than a sliver of bread, that she wandered the gardens after dusk, whispering in a tongue they did not know. The younger servants said she left notes for a falconer who no longer worked at the palace, and that the birds came anyway. One guard claimed she spoke with the captain of the navy in the stables, not once, but many times and always when the king was away in the archives. And yet there was never proof, only shadows, only whispers. Seraphine kept a journal, no. One saw she wrote in it by moonlight, with ink the color of blood-dark wine, her pen moving slow and even across parchment. Some said it was poetry. Some feared it was maps. Meanwhile, Leontis drifted deeper into love. He believed he had found not only a queen, but a mirror, someone who understood stillness, who craved the same gentle world he wished to build. He did not see the cold behind her calm. He did not hear the weight behind her questions. For him, she was a comfort, the soft voice in a hard world. But for her, he was a door into secrets, into strategies, into a kingdom whose weaknesses could be charted with enough patience and silence. Outside the walls, the kingdom slept beneath its blanket of snow. Inside, something stirred, something that had already begun to shift the future, one soft footstep at a time. The spring thaw came earlier than expected. Ice retreated from the castle steps, revealing moss beneath the stones and long-forgotten cracks in the walkways. Birds returned. Bells rang in the village below for the planting season. And yet, within the palace, a new kind of cold settled in. The king had grown pale, not in sickness, but in spirit. His meetings shortened. Letters went unanswered. He smiled less often, and when he did, it felt like memory rather than joy. Some thought he was simply burdened with rule. Others feared that something unseen had taken hold. But the truth was quieter than illness and slower than fear. It was doubt, not loud, not sharp, just a soft, persistent murmur in the back of the mind. Leontis had begun to wonder. It started with a simple parchment, one that had not passed through him, yet bore his seal. Then another, a message to the southern coast, signed in his name, requesting troop movements that he had never approved. He questioned his scribes. They knew nothing. He asked his advisors. They offered shrugs and silence. But when he asked Seraphine, she met his gaze without flinching. She told him he was tired, that stress could blur the mind, that he ought to rest, that she would take care of the small matters. And he believed her. He had to, because to doubt her would be to unravel his entire heart. And so he nodded, and the documents continued, and the quiet deepened. In the village, the people noticed fewer guards on the walls, fewer ships in the harbor. Rumors drifted like pollen. Soft, weightless, dangerous. The queen had eyes that saw too much. The king had eyes that were slowly closing. And in the stillness of the throne room, as the wind from the coast pressed against the stained glass windows, Seraphine wrote another letter. in a language no one in the castle could read. Summer arrived, but warmth did not follow. The sun hung low over the kingdom, golden but distant, as if unsure whether to bless or burn. Crops rose slowly. Trade slowed. The people smiled less in the streets. In the palace, Seraphine moved with grace, always with grace, but now with guards flanking her at all times. Not for her safety, but because she requested it. She said it made her feel protected. No one questioned her. She had become something. Beyond queen, something carved from ritual and mystery. Foreign visitors began to arrive, cloaked in strange silks and speaking through interpreters. They bowed to her longer than they did to the king. They shared stories of distant empires. They brought maps no one had seen before. And in the gardens, where once only roses grew, now stood statues of unfamiliar gods. The king watched this unfold like one might watch a dream, soft, confusing, and hard to hold. He still loved her, but something within him had begun to fracture. A quiet ache, like the sound of rope slowly pulling apart. He confided in his childhood friend, a scholar named Alaric, who had returned from the Northern University. Alaric listened, nodded, and asked only one question. When was the last time she didn't know something before you told her? Leontes had no answer. That night, he did not sleep. He walked the corridors of his own home like a guest, touching the stone walls as if trying to remember what they once meant. And in a high tower window, he saw her silhouetted by candlelight, pen in hand again, writing by the open breeze. Below her, a messenger rode off into the dark. No trumpet. Number? Torch, just hooves on stone, disappearing into the forest beyond the walls. The forest beyond the castle had long been considered sacred, not by decree, but by silence. Children were warned not to wander there. Elders spoke of old pathways that changed their course. But now, that forest held the tracks of horses, deep and recent. The king, alone and restless, left the palace one morning before sunrise, cloaked and hooded, riding a dark mare with no crest or banner. He followed the road east, where the trees began to lean together, and the air smelled of wet bark and memory. He was not chasing her. He was chasing the feeling, the ache that something had escaped him. He came upon a clearing where the soil was freshly turned. In the center stood a stone post, not a monument, not a grave, but a message. Upon it were carved for simple words, in a language older than his crown. Words he had seen before. In the Queen's journal, he had not understood them then. He did now. His hands trembled. That night, he returned through the side gates unseen. He ordered no inquiry, spoke to no one, and burned the clothes he had worn. But from that day forward, he became a man split in two. One half still smiled in court, gave speeches, rode in processions. The other half stood quietly in the shadows, watching every flicker of ink on her desk. She remained kind, attentive, loving, but her eyes, they watched him too now, just a fraction of a moment longer than they used to. Something between them had changed, and neither dared name it. Autumn crept in with soft winds and fading colors. Leaves drifted like old memories, fragile and quiet, covering the cobblestones in gold and rust. Within the palace walls, change continued its slow, silent march. New advisors arrived, names unfamiliar, their accents strange, their loyalties unclear. Old servants quietly disappeared, their posts left unspoken for. The kitchens grew quieter. The music in the halls played in a different key. Leontes still wore his crown, still sat upon the carved wooden throne that bore the seal of his father's reign. But the seat felt colder now. He spoke less, listened more. And when Seraphine entered the room, all eyes turned to her first. She was never cruel. She never raised her voice. But her presence pressed against the room like velvet draped over stone, soft but unmovable. She had begun to speak of reforms, of aligning with distant allies, of new philosophies that sounded noble yet unfamiliar. And every time she spoke, the king nodded. Not in agreement, but in delay. He was buying time, though he didn't yet know what for. That evening, in the fading light, he walked through the portrait gallery alone. Paintings of kings and queens long gone looked down on him with cracked oil smiles. And as he passed the last canvas, an unfinished portrait of Seraphine, he stopped. The painter had captured her eyes too well. He stood there a long while, unsure whether he felt love or fear or both. Outside, the trees whispered. And somewhere in the distance, a bell rang once. The first snow fell without. Warning: no wind, no trumpet of winter's approach. Just soft flakes descending on the roof tiles and gathering in silence. The palace, already quiet, fell quieter still. Fires burned lower, windows fogged with breath. And within the walls, Linus began to make copies. Quietly, carefully, by his own hand. He took her letters, the ones written in symbols no one else could understand, and began tracing them, each stroke with care, hiding them behind loose stones in his study. He did not know the language, but he knew the rhythm. Each loop and line carried a purpose, a message meant for someone else. He no longer hoped she was innocent. He simply hoped he was wrong. On the 5th night of snowfall, he followed one of her messengers. He wore a merchant's cloak, walked with a limp, and moved like a shadow, through the streets, into the old part of the city where the stonework crumbled and names were etched in languages long forgotten. The messenger entered a building without a sign. When Leontes peered through the cracks in the shutters, he saw papers changing hands, his kingdom's maps, his own decrees, mirrored and marked in red ink. He did not shout, he did not enter. He turned back through the falling snow, one hand against the wall to steady himself. That night he sat in the dark, the crown beside him, untouched, and for the first time since the day of their wedding, he wept. Days passed without shape. The palace clock chimed, but the hours bled together like melted wax. Snow blanketed the kingdom, the roads fell silent. Caravans stopped arriving. The court grew thinner. Rumors began to rise like smoke from a hearth, slow, curling, impossible to grasp. Whispers of foreign coins in the market of soldiers who answered two voices outside the crown. The king said nothing. Not yet. He walked the halls like a memory searching for a door. His once bold steps had turned careful. Every candle seemed to flicker with hesitation. At the morning council, Seraphine spoke for him. With ease, with certainty. She named new trade routes. She dismissed an old chancellor. She signed a decree without waiting for his seal. No one stopped her. And still, her voice was soft, kind, unthreatening. But beneath that softness, there was a spine of iron, masked in velvet. Linus watched, nodding gently, hands folded in stillness. That night, he returned to the tower room where she first began writing her letters. The inkpot was there, still warm. A feather quill recently dipped, and beside it, a journal half full. He did not open it. He simply closed his eyes and stood in the hush, not out of fear, but grief. Grief for a marriage built on illusion. Grief for a queen who perhaps had once loved him, or still did. But not enough to tell the truth. The frost did not lift that winter. Even when the sun returned, its light felt pale, unsure. And within the palace, the cold settled not just in stone and glass, but in trust. Servants moved more slowly now, glancing before speaking. The guards stood stiffer, their hands hovering closer to the hilts of their blades. And Seraphine. She smiled more. She laughed gently at court, gifted warm cloaks to the wives of soldiers, visited kitchens and nurseries with a kind heart and quiet hands. To most, she had become the light in the frozen halls. But Leanta's new light could blind as well as guide. One evening, a guest arrived, cloaked, tall, with no name offered. Seraphine greeted him not with surprise, but with a familiarity too smooth to ignore. They spoke in a language he did not recognize, their conversation brief but musical, like a tune long practiced. The man departed before moonrise. Lena said nothing, but the moment echoed. That night, he ordered the locks changed quietly, a different blacksmith, a different metal. And the next morning, he summoned the palace gardener, not for flowers, but for roots. The old man came, trembling, and when asked, he described how the queen had once sent him to bury a small, sealed box near the orchard, deep under twisted branches. That afternoon, with hands wrapped in linen, Leanda dug. The box was there. Inside, letters. Dozens, not from her, but to her, in a cipher not even his scholars could break. He stared at them until his breath fogged the air. Then, gently, he closed the lid. The snow began to fall again, slowly, softly, as if to cover all things. By early spring, the snow melted, but nothing truly thawed. Buds appeared on branches, and birds returned to the hedgerows, but inside the palace, time felt paused, like a breath held too long. The courtiers smiled, but more carefully. The servants bowed, but not as low. And the king had become two men. The one who dined, nodded, ruled as expected, and the one who listened behind closed doors, reading old letters, searching for meaning between the lines. He rarely confronted her now. He didn't need to. The silence between them had become louder than any accusation. At the spring festival, they stood side by side, waving to the gathered crowd, dressed in silks and gold, but their hands never touched. That evening, Seraphine retired early, citing a headache. The king remained at the feast, but his eyes were far away. Later that night, he descended into the vaults, a place most had forgotten. The walls were damp with age, lit only by oil lamps that hissed softly. It was there he kept the box and the letters. And another thing, a map. One that showed his borders not as they were, but as they might be divided, claimed labeled in a script from her homeland. He sat there for hours, not panicked, not broken, but quietly preparing. He would not banish her, not yet, not out of weakness, but wisdom. He needed to know who she truly answered to, and what she would do when he no longer followed her script. The days grew longer, but the light brought no warmth. In the gardens, the roses opened, but in the palace, no such blooming came. The queen remained serene. She hosted visiting nobles with grace, offered wine to widows of fallen soldiers, and arranged music for the palace halls. Her voice still carried a sweetness, but her eyes rarely met his. And when they did, it was as though she were looking past him, not with cruelty, but with distance, like someone remembering a song she no longer sang. The king, now more shadow than sun, began writing letters of his own. Not in cipher, not in code, but with clarity. He sent them to old allies, forgotten cousins, watchers at far borders. Not of war, not yet, but of watching, of listening, of readiness. One letter in particular he sent to the west, to the only realm that had once fought beside her homeland. He signed it with no title, only his name. And a question? Do you know her face? The reply, when it came weeks later, was brief. 3 lines, no signature, but the seal matched a diplomat long believed dead. The letter read, yes. Once she rode under a different flag. She was called Selene. That name he had never heard, but it rang through him like a distant bell. That night, he stood by her chamber door, listening. The room was quiet. Only the soft sound of a quill against parchment. Writing, always writing. He turned away, slowly, and walked back through the hush of his kingdom, the walls whispering with every step. Selene, the name, followed him. Not like thunder, but like a feather carried by wind, always drifting just ahead of thought. He said it once aloud, alone in the council chamber, letting the syllables rest on his tongue. It felt foreign. Not her voice, not her laugh, but it was her. A version that existed before the crown, before the vows, before the kingdom knew her. Name as Seraphine. He began reading everything again. Old treaties, diplomatic records, lists of marriages that had never been celebrated. And slowly a story emerged. Of a girl born not to nobility, but to loyalty. Not to this kingdom, but to its oldest rival. A girl who learned languages faster than most learned to walk. Who vanished from record at 15. Who reappeared years later beside a foreign ambassador in silk robes under a different name. Charming a young prince during a summer festival of masks. That prince had been Leonis, the summer he met Seraphine, and now the mask felt permanent. Not deception, perhaps, but design. She had always known who she was. The question was, had she ever forgotten it? Had anything been real? Their shared garden walks, their sleepless talks before dawn. The nights she touched his cheek and whispered promises no longer spoken. The king did not rage. He did not weep. He simply breathed, slower now, and knew that some stories do not break in one loud moment. Some stories unwind, thread by thread, until the shape of the truth is undeniable and sorrowfully still. The days passed like pages, turning in a book he no longer chose to read. Nothing changed on the surface. The meals were served. The council met. The music played in the inner halls. But beneath it all, something fragile had snapped. The queen moved through the palace like mist, graceful, ungraspable, untouched. She still spoke gently with the maids, still knelt at the chapel pews in morning light, still left warm bread on the steps of the servants' wing. But Leontis no longer followed her with his gaze. He watched her shadow instead. One evening, a small gathering was held to honor a distant cousin returning from war. Wine flowed, harps played, but the queen did not attend. When asked, the king only said, "She has taken to quieter company." That night, he entered her private library. A room once filled with laughter and books, exchanged like secrets. Now it smelled of dust and silence. He touched the spines of volumes she loved, and stopped at one with a ribbon tucked inside. When he opened it, a loose page fell to the floor. On it, a name written 3 times in her hand. Selene, Selene, Selene. Beneath it, nothing. No message, no signature. Just the repetition of a truth she could no longer bury. And yet, there was something soft in the handwriting. Not pride, not remorse, but memory. As if she, too, had begun to wonder which name had held her longer. The one she was given, or the one she chose. That night, neither of them slept. In different wings of the castle, 2 candles burned late, and in the quiet between them, regret folded itself like a blanket around the stone walls. Spring drifted into summer, though the days felt colder. No frost on the windows, no storms. In the sky, just an absence of warmth in the spaces where love once lived. The queen rarely left her wing now. When she did, her steps were slow, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as if holding something unseen. The servants moved around her like shadows, quiet and respectful, but unsure where their loyalty should fall. One morning, a letter arrived, no seal, no name. Just a folded slip of parchment tucked inside a bouquet of wild lavender from the southern border. The king read it twice. It said little, just a phrase. She remembers the river. He burned the note without flinching. But the meaning stayed with him. That phrase belonged to a place neither kingdom marked on maps, a small bend in the river where long ago Two young figures had once met under false names. He had believed it chance, but perhaps she had not. That evening, he sent for her. Not through a summons, but with a question written on linen. "Did you ever lie to me when you were not told to?" She came to him just past dusk. No guards, no attendants. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before entering. Her face was tired, but not frightened, and in the silence between them, nothing needed to be said. He did not accuse. She did not explain. They simply sat in the old music room among the dusty keys of a harp, untouched since winter. And for the first time in many weeks, they looked at each other. Not as spy and king, not even as queen and husband, but as two people who had once tried to build a truth from borrowed stories and had almost succeeded. The castle grew quiet in those weeks. Not from sorrow, but from something softer, a tired kind of peace. No declarations were made. No trials were called. The queen remained, her crown untouched, her footsteps slower. The king returned to his duties, though with less certainty in his voice. They met now and then in public, always polite, never too close. And yet something had shifted. In the gardens, they sometimes passed one another, pausing only long enough to nod. Once, by the old fountain, she offered him a fig from the basket on her arm. He took it without a word. No guards followed her any more. Not because she was trusted, but because watching her felt unnecessary now. She went nowhere, sent no messages. Not that anyone saw, but there were signs of change. Small ones. The southern gates reopened. Certain prisoners were quietly pardoned. Trade with old enemies resumed beneath new terms. A map once burned was now redrawn, with softer borders and gentler lines. It was said the queen advised these changes, but her name was not signed to them. The king took responsibility for each decree, yet in his handwriting a softness had returned. Less command, more care. Still, no one spoke of the truth. Not aloud, her past remained buried beneath silk and silence. His heartbreak wrapped in ritual. Together, they ruled, but differently now. As if walking across a frozen lake, never too fast, never too deep. And though the castle remained standing, it felt lighter somehow, as if the weight of pretending had been traded for the weight of simply continuing. Late summer arrived with golden evenings and slower hours. The air smelled of lavender and dry wheat, and the castle walls warmed under long sunsets. People spoke of peace now, not with celebration, but with relief. No wars had broken out. No crowns had fallen. But something had ended quietly beneath the silk. The queen no longer attended councils, though her name was still spoken in certain rooms. The king rarely mentioned her, yet her influence clung to the corners of his words. In truth, they had not spoken alone in many weeks, but they wrote little notes, left folded in books or tucked beneath empty cups. Thoughts without names, questions without answers. On one such note, he had written, "Do we remember the same river, or just the same rain?" She never replied, not with words, but a small sketch was returned, a willow tree bending toward the water. Beneath it, no faces, just the curve of the riverbank, drawn from memory. One day, she disappeared for several hours. No one followed. No one dared. When she returned, her hair was damp, and there were petals caught in her sleeves. She said nothing. But that night, a decree was issued. The Western prisoners, those accused of dissent during the war, would be released. No explanation given, just freedom. And for those who understood history, it was enough. The past had not been rewritten, but it had, perhaps, been folded gently and placed on a shelf, not forgotten, not forgiven, simply acknowledged. And in that soft gesture, something in the kingdom began to breathe again. Autumn crept in with cooler winds and skies of silver gray. The palace halls grew quieter, not from absence, but from stillness. Curtains fluttered in open windows, and the scent of burning leaves mingled with old perfume. The queen spent her mornings in the eastern garden now, among the asters and drying roses. Children sometimes wandered there, not noble ones, but from the village school, curious, wide-eyed, and unafraid. She told them stories, never about herself. Tales of faraway storms, mountain kings, or clever birds who carried secrets on their wings. They listened as though listening itself were a kind of spell. The king watched from the upper balcony some days, never interrupting. He had taken to writing again, not decrees, but something more private. Pages filled with wandering. Thoughts and half-remembered moments left unsigned in a leather-bound book. One afternoon, he wrote a line and paused. Perhaps forgiveness isn't loud. The queen had not asked for it. He had not offered it. And yet, here they were, ruling a kingdom no longer bleeding, only healing. There were banquets again, though quieter. Candles glowed in long halls. Music drifted in from chambers where once silence had sat like stone. They did not sit side by side anymore. But neither were they far apart. In the space between them, memory rested. Sharp, not soft, just present. Like a book-long read. Its ending known, but still held, because the weight of it felt like something worth remembering. Years passed as they always do, slowly in memory, quickly in motion. The queen grew older, though gracefully so, her silver hair often tied with blue ribbon, her voice a little lower, her eyes still steady. The king aged as well. His beard whitened, and he walked with a cane carved from the wood of an old tree. Near the river, neither spoke of the past any more, not even in glances. But every winter, without fail, they spent one evening in the music room, the same quiet space with the harp by the window. They never invited anyone. No announcements were made. They simply arrived, separately, and stayed until the fire burned low. Sometimes she would hum a tune from long ago, and he would sit with his eyes closed, listening. No words, just presence. Their rule was remembered as one of steadiness. Not glory, not tragedy, but something gentler. The court poets never sang of betrayal or war. Instead, they wrote of a reign where silence had been understood, and where dignity had taken the place of punishment. Foreign visitors often noted a stillness in the palace, not from fear, but from peace, as if the air itself had learned to breathe without pressing too hard. And in the village, the children grew up hearing stories about a queen who once feared nothing and a king who once forgave quietly. Most of them never knew the full truth, but they didn't need to. Because sometimes legacy isn't built from answers, it is built from the choice to remain, even when the truth is hard, and to rule with a heart that learns how to carry it. The final winter came without thunder. No great storms, no cries from the mountains, only soft snow gathering. On the palace roofs, the queen passed first in her sleep, in a room filled with candlelight and pressed herbs. There were no last words, only a faint smile and the steady hand of a nurse who sat beside her until morning. When the king was told, he did not speak. He simply rose, took her last letter from the drawer, never opened, always known, and held it against his chest. A day later, he visited the garden where she once told stories to children. There, beneath the willow tree drawn on parchment so long ago, he planted a single root. A small sprouting thing, quiet in the frost. He died weeks later with no ceremony. By choice, just the sound of wind against stone, and a book, their book, left open by his bedside. In the years that followed, their story became a whisper. Not one of scandal, but of something deeper. Teachers spoke of a reign that healed without noise. Farmers remembered the queen's decree that gave them their land back. And poets, years later, found their letters and wrote them into lullabies. A gravestone was placed beneath a willow. It bore no title, only these words: "They ruled in silence, and they chose to stay." And so, dear listener, if your eyes have grown heavy, let them rest. For tonight's tale has reached its final page. The wind still moves through the garden. The seeds still sleep in the earth, and the crown, like history, rests softly in the dark.